Hello, and welcome to the Wade Borth Podcast. I'm your host, Wade Borth, and in every episode, my goal is to get you to think differently about how money works and ultimately to empower you to take control of your money and your personal financing system. Welcome back to another episode of Talking About Money. Today, I have a special guest again, Kira Nyland. Kira and I have known each other for a number of years. And I thought today, just so you didn't have to listen to me talk all the time, Kira's going to ask me some questions and we're going to talk. The conversation today is going to be around how money works. And I know this is a big subject. It's kind of a broad subject, but I think it's important for us to understand what this means. So welcome, Kira. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me again.
You're always fun to have on. It's always exciting to see what happens. And I'm looking forward to the questions you might have. From a perspective of somebody that hasn't worked with money, or I think everybody works with money on a daily basis, but working as a profession in the financing world or the insurance business or whatever it might be. But I think it's very important for people to have this discussion about how money works, because money is that tool that allows us to do many, many things in life. Would you agree?
Oh, completely agree.
And it's funny because, the discussion around money is very difficult for some people. We talk about money, and I heard it said that some people would rather talk about their sex life before they talk about money. And I think there's certain things around money that people's brains fall out of their head when you mention money or dollar bills or whatever it might be. So we want to take it kind of to a high level discussion about money, more so about the thoughts around money versus just dollars and cents, because there's a lot of advice about dollars and cents and where you should invest, where you should put your money, what you should spend it on. Everybody has an opinion about that, but I think fitting into more of my my values and my what's important to me, it's about this. If we had this infinite knowledge in the garden, and there's weeds growing up everywhere, if you just imagine looking out at your garden. And I can do that through my window, by the way. I can see my garden out here, and it's full of weeds because it's been a drought this year. But if your mind is full of, all the prosperous things that you could have, all the bounty that you could have, and you have this garden out there that's just full of weeds. And I think a lot of the information, a lot of the misconception about money is that somebody's planted those weeds in your garden, and nobody's helped you, nobody's empowered you to go and take those weeds out of the garden so you can be the most prosperous you can be with your money, or with that crop that's out there in that garden. So today we're going to address a couple of those issues as we go along. So anything from you, Kira, as we move into the subject?
Well, I think one of the things that I really enjoy about our conversations is offline without obviously being on a podcast, but just our general banter of, checking in and stuff, is we never know where a topic is going to go. And one of the things that you and I most recently discussed was we talked about the mindset of money.
Yeah.
And how everybody has a different mindset about it, how they spend it, how they save it, what it means to them. For some people, that's buying brand name stuff every time they go to the grocery store instead of buying the generic brand to save money. Or it means buying your kids' clothes secondhand, toddler clothes secondhand, and toys secondhand, and things like that. And for some people, it's about spending money on materialistic things. You go and you buy a $500 handbag, whereas I can go on Amazon and buy a $20 handbag, and it fits me just fine. Or
Right.
some people prefer to spend their money on experiences. And to me, how I view money and my mindset towards money is different than my best friend, or other people that I work with. So it's just this major mindset, and it kind of leads me to something else that I've heard you say before, is that how we use our money is the most valuable business of our lives. How we put it to
Yeah.
work, which is, again, how we spend it, how we save it. And so I kind of wanted to ask you to explain, that statement a little bit further from your perspective in what you do.
Well, those are good points. I'll go back to how people spend money first, and what they spend it on. And this is what I really think is the key. Is just in my business alone, and talking with my clients, we get a lot of what does it cost? What's it cost? And really, the question should be, what is the value we're getting out of it? So, for example, some people say, well, I got a 3-year-old that's going to wear a pair of jeans once. Do I need to spend? And I don't do the shopping in my house, so this is like so off base. Are we going to spend $30 or $40 on a pair of jeans for my 3 or 4-year-old? Do I see value in that, or do I see more value saying I can spend $10 on a pair of jeans they're going to wear once or twice before they grow out of them. And again, it's a comparison between cost and value. And I think a lot of people look at those two as being the same. So just a simple example of that is, what am I willing to pay for, and what's the value that I'm getting out of it? And I'll use the example now. This might date me a little bit, but I was in downtown Minneapolis one time. This is before Uber, and it was probably 1:30 at night. And in order to pay a taxi, you paid cash back in the day. They didn't swipe credit cards. That was the day before they would swipe credit cards. I had like $20 in my pocket. I wasn't thinking, right. So, and so I go to the ATM machine that was sitting on the corner there, and they were going to charge me, I think at that time, $15 to do an ATM transaction. Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, well, it's 1 o'clock in the morning or 1:30 in the morning. I need to pay cash to, pay the taxi cash in order to get them back to my hotel. That was tremendous value. It was extreme cost, but it was tremendous value. And again, that's just a simple example of, I was more than willing to pay that because it got me what I wanted when I wanted it. Now, as I look back at it, it was expensive, to take $100 out there, hitting you 15 bucks to do it. That's 15%. So when we put the percentage and the pencils to it in the calculator, I would say it was extremely expensive. And I don't disagree with that, but I found the value that I wanted on it. I wanted a ride back to my hotel room. And that's one of the key things, the difference between, what it costs versus, what the value is. And that's kind of everything in our conversations, because we've been conditioned to be Walmart shoppers, for lack of a better word. We're always looking for the lowest price, when in all reality, we should say, well, what's the most value I'm getting out of what I'm doing? Because we have this, traditionally, most people will trade time for money. And so when they see their time being exhausted because they're paying $15 for an ATM fee, they won't do it. Well, and that's kind of a way to look at it, because they see time being a finite asset, a resource. And so as we think about it from that standpoint, we have to look at, what are we really going to get? How does it really fit, what we're doing with our money? How is it really fitting in hitting our long-term goals and sufficing what we're desiring to get going forward? So, and if it's doing that, then really what difference is the cost? If that dollar being spent is getting us to where we want to be, right? And the other side of that equation is, and again, this is just going back to the psychology of money a little bit, is that when people need something, they're pretty much going to pay the least amounts possible, right? If you think about that, if I need to have something, I'm going to find the lowest cost of anything that's out there. If I truly want something because it truly fits into my goals, my objectives, what am I willing to pay? Pretty much anything I have to make it happen. And so when we take a look at the psychology of money, that's one of the big things that are out there, is that we have this idea of, is this a want or a need? And when it becomes a need, we don't want to pay as much as we want for it. But if it's truly a want, if it's truly to make our kids have a better life, you ask parents, what are you willing to spend on your kids, or what are you willing to do to have your kids benefit? Well, everything I have is usually a response I get, or something along that lines. And again, that's still the psychology of money, is that how much you're willing to spend on a pair of shoes for a 2-year-old, or a 1-year-old. I don't exactly what age they start walking at, between 1 and 2, right? Am I close to that? And so you're putting shoes on a kid that's not going to walk yet. Well, I'm not going to spend a lot because they need them, because it's cold in North Dakota, so they need shoes. But am I going to spend $80 for a pair of shoes? I may or may not. I don't see the value in that, so I don't see the value in it, so I'm not going to spend as much money. So again, it's how we think about money is very, very important, and the words we use around it, need versus want, value versus cost. Those are all things that we have to be aware of as we make decisions about those dollars that we have. That makes sense?
Yeah, and it's funny that the need here, you talk about the need versus want thing. That's a big thing for me when it comes to budgeting my own money is, okay, I need this. And it I do tend to go for the most economical price, but I also am smart enough to know that what is always economical doesn't always come with quality, which means that if I'm gonna have to repurchase it or something like that, And
Right.
then for me, the want is, yes, I may really want something, but then it is, how does this add value to my life by wanting something that is not part of my, monthly budget, etc. And, in back to the kind of the whole need versus want when it comes to kids' clothing. As you know, I have a 4-year old and he's growing like a weed. And when it comes time for winter coats, winter boots, or even just some basic clothes items, the first place I go is consignment because I can get so much more bang for my buck. He's going to get them dirty. He's all boy. He's going to get them dirty. He's going to put holes in them. And for me, I would rather spend my money on experiences with him that he is going to remember, hopefully remember as he gets older, and that he will, if he decides to have kids when he's older, that he can turn those experiences and memories into new memories for his family. So for me, that's where that added value comes from in buying things, that are secondhand and how I spend my money.
Yeah. Because again, it falls into what is your founding principles? What are those pillars that surround you? And it's like you want the experience form. So again, what you see as value may not be the same thing as what other people see as value. And this is the challenge, working with clients in the financial world is that, and I say it's a challenge, but actually I think it's actually even more than that. It's a blessing because everybody has a different set of values, and there's no way that a cookie cutter approach. And this is what drives me crazy about this industry and a lot of industry around is that they want everybody to fit into a cookie cutter approach. They want a Dave Ramsey of this world to tell them this is exactly what you need to do. All he did was he took your values, threw them out the window, and he imported his values and said that's how you have to do it. Versus saying, well, let's take a look at what's valuable to you, what's important to you, where do your values lie? Versus this idea of this cookie cutter approach fits everybody. How does that work? Because you and I just had this discussion about how different people spend their money on clothes for their kids. Well, isn't it the same in everything we do? Like if it's investing, if it's buying assets, whatever it might be, everybody has a different set of values. And my job, quite frankly, and where I find interest working with people are people that have very similar values to that I have. They don't have to have the same exact ones, but they have to be in somewhat of an alignment to having those same values. And if we do, then I can empower them. I'm not going to do it for them. I'm not going to tell them exactly what they need to do because again, it's their life, their values. But I can empower them to go pull those weeds out of their garden, so that knowledge and that information they have in their garden is as much true crop and bounty as they want and as they planted for it. If that makes sense?
Yeah. And by, buying my little one's stuff, secondhand or waiting for sales and things like that, I might spend, granted, his speaking of weeds, his feet are growing like weeds. So the amount of money I'm having to spend on shoes is quite a bit. But when I look at probably what, we've spent in the course of a year, I'd be willing to guess that it's 50 to 75% less than some other people. And I view that as that 50 and 75% less that I didn't spend, I can either use one for experiences for him, or two, I can look at it as an investment in his future
Yeah.
because I can be putting that money into his savings, or, buying a policy to use for his college fund, or, for him later in life and things like that. And to me, that is what's most important because I never want my child or anybody that I know and I care about to suffer or to feel stressed and anxious about their financial situation.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I have that mindset and go towards, right?
Right.
Um, and I think that kind of is a really good segue into my next question for you, actually, is, one of the things that you love to use as an analogy is you have to love yourself more than Wells Fargo.
Yeah.
And I think that that's, a good analogy. And I kind of want you to explain to the listeners why that is one of your favorite sayings when it comes to money.
Yeah, that it is true that way, and it really again, this is all going back to how we think about money. And I always want people to understand that we've been conditioned to think about money a certain way. We've been conditioned from the standpoint of people trying to influence us to use our money to best serve them. Does it best serve us? It may or may not, but that's a lot of what happens, right? So I want people to take a step back and say, because you made a mention too, and we didn't really cover it, is that money and finance and money and banking is the most important thing that you do in your life, right? It's one of the most important business in your personal life. And so what I mean by that is how we think about it and how we use it and how we put it to use for us. Because again, money isn't, it's just a tool. It's just a tool for us to use for exchange to buy those things of value that we want, right? But the question is how do we put that tool to use? Are we using a screwdriver as a pry bar? Are we using a screwdriver as a hammer, for lack of a better analogy? Because we have this bucket of money. And what I try, the conversations that you and I have had, that we have a lot with clients and other agents, is how are we thinking about our money? Nelson Nash, in his book, Becoming Your Own Banker, the Infinite Banking Concept, he made the comment that, if you took all the money in the world and evenly distributed amongst every single person in this world, so one day in life, everybody had the same dollar amount in their pocket or in their bank account. He makes the point, within 10 years, 10% of the people would have 90% of their wealth back in their pockets. Now, there's no way we can prove that. There's no way we can even get there. But I'm a firm believer in that idea, because people that have wealth think differently than people that don't. And what goes back to this idea of that we have to love ourselves and our family more than we love Wells Fargo. And what I mean by that is, for example, if I take $10,000 or $20,000 or $50,000, whatever it is, it doesn't matter the dollar amount, and I go purchase a car, or I go make a purchase of some sort, am I treating the most valuable asset in my financial tool crib, which is my money, my cash, better than Wells Fargo would treat it? Or am I treating my money better than I'm treating Wells Fargo's money? So what I mean by that is, if we take a loan from Wells Fargo, we use Wells Fargo money to make that purchase. What do we typically do when we make that purchase from Wells Fargo? We pay it back, right? When we pay it back with principal and interest, right?
Typically.
Well, yeah. Even in today's environment, people are going to say, well, I get a lower interest rate, or I might have a higher. It doesn't really make any difference. We still pay it back with principal and interest. Well, if we use our own money to make that same purchase, what does the average typical condition thought process tell us to do? Nothing, right? We're told it's our money. Why? We take the money from our earnings, put it in an envelope, and then we buy that car with cash. Do you see the problem there? Is that there's a consumer mindset and there's a business mindset. There's a wealth building mindset and a consumer mindset. We've been conditioned to think as a consumer. We consume our money. Do we grow in wealth, build our money? Absolutely not. We've consumed our money. That's what we've been taught to do. Where the banks, as much as we might dislike them, disagree with them a lot, the process of banking is very bright. It's very smart how they do it. They take $1 or they take $50,000, they give it to you to use with the expectation you're going to pay back principal and interest. And then they turn around and do it to 10,000 other people, or 100,000 other people, 1 million other people, whatever it might be. This is how banks think, where we as individuals will take that same $30,000, $40,000, or $50,000, pay cash for something, if it's our own money, if we pay cash with it, with no intent ever to pay it back with principal and interest. So my point is, when we use Wells Fargo's money, we're willing to pay that principal and interest. But when we use our own money, the average American, the person with a conditioned mindset, is told, well, it's my money. Why would I want to pay it back? That makes sense?
Mm-hmm. That absolutely does.
And this is the difference between those that have wealth and really those that don't, is that are we a consumer mindset, or are we a wealth building mindset? And I think a lot of that, it kind of revolves around this idea of a scarcity mindset. And what I mean by that is, again, people traditionally trade time, which is a finite resource in my life and your life, right? So there's only so much time we have on this earth before we graduate. We trade that time for money over our lifetime. And so, when we start doing that, we take all our time to make a couple of dollars, then what do we do with that money? If you think about this, and this is the whole psychology of money that we talk about. If we take our finite asset, our finite resource, which is time, and then we turn it into money, which we now think is a finite resource as well, which I would almost disagree with. Money can be an infinite source, or it can be an infinite resource if we understand and treat it right. And then we take that money and then we give it to somebody else to manage. Why do we take one of our most valuable assets, which are probably our most valuable assets, which is our finite amount of time that we have on this earth that we just exchanged for money, and then we take that money and we give it to somebody else to manage, or we give it to somebody else with more value than we put it in ourselves, and we allow the government to put restrictions on it. I mean, you talk about the opposite of freedom. That is the opposite of freedom. We're willing to take a very, very, very valuable asset, resource in time, turn it into money, and then give it to somebody else, or allow somebody else to put restrictions on it. Just a real simple example around that. And this is really a key in what we do, is getting people to think differently about how those things go. If you think about the idea of what we call economic value, this was written back in the 70s. This idea behind economic value added, EVA. And what happened was, most corporations at one time saw money like consumers see money today. They have money sitting in their accounts, and so they think they need to spend it. And Coca-Cola was a good example of this. And Nelson Nash wrote about it in his book again. And he talked about, we take our money, or Coca-Cola took their money, opened up bottling plants all over the country, and then they looked at the books and they go, oh my gosh, these bottling plants are making all kinds of money. Well, because they had one of the most valuable assets, cash, that they bought these bottling plants with, they didn't charge interest for. So Coca-Cola at the time, back in the 70s, saw very little value in their money because they were willing to give it away for free. They were giving it away, the use of that money, for free. Does that make sense? And now, then some accountant comes along and goes, hey, wait a second, we're not charging interest for the use of that money. Interest is just, it's just a charge to use somebody else's money, right? So if I borrow your car and want to put 50,000 miles on it a year, I probably should pay you something for the use of that car, should I not? I mean, unless it's your brother-in-law. Because he's probably going to think he doesn't have to pay for it. But the point is, you have an asset. And if somebody's using up that asset, they should be paying you. They should love you and say, hey, thank you for allowing me to borrow that money, that asset, whatever that asset is, because that's your time, right? Think about that from the time standpoint. That's your finite time. Thank you for allowing me to use that. I'm going to pay you for the use of that because I love you so much. And again, we use cash, and people's brains seem to fall out of their head when they start talking about cash, right? And talking about money and finances. They just don't apply the same logic and reasoning to it as most people do, as we should, not as most people do. But the thought process comes back to, we have this asset of money, and when we put it to work, we should make sure that it is one of our most valuable assets. So we should charge like it's our most valuable asset. If we're charging ourselves, charging our brother-in-law, charging anybody, we should, once we put it to work and somebody else is using it, we should get a return on the use of those dollars. And that's all economic value talks about. That's what we're really talking about when we say we should love our family more than we love Wells Fargo. Because if we use Wells Fargo money to buy a car, we're willing to pay, I don't know what's the interest rate on a vehicle, 5% or whatever it might be. We're willing to pay that interest in principal back to Wells Fargo over a 5, 8, 7, 6-year period of time, whatever it is. But why aren't we willing to do that for ourselves or our family? People that have wealth understand that concept, and that's exactly what they do. They rarely have a purchase of any sort to buy any asset that they don't have a plan to pay it back, because they understand how money works. Again, this goes back to the idea that if you evenly distributed money back to everybody throughout the world, that within 5 or 10 years, 10% of the population would still have 90% of the money back in their accounts, because they understand that process right there.
Does this, the process and the mindset, the most valuable business of our lives and loving our family more than Wells Fargo, does this apply differently for a 20-year-old fresh out of college versus a 30-year-old getting married, having their first kid, versus a 60-year-old, either just recently retired or gearing up for retirement?
Well, I think the founding principles, the foundational principles of the thought process don't change for anyone. If I'm having a conversation with a 20-year-old about how money works, how it's designed to work, and how we think about it, right? This whole idea behind EVA and paying for items that we pay cash for isn't any different than a conversation with a 60-year-old. I think the implementation might be a little bit different. And the reason I say that is because it goes back to the whole idea between, what's of value to those individuals. What's of value to a 60-year-old is definitely different than what's of value to a 20-year-old. I look back at my life and thinking about what was important when I was 25 versus 55. Completely different, right? My set of values have changed, but my thought process around those have changed. My time horizon, as I've gotten older, my time horizon's gotten longer. It seems kind of funny that way, almost counterintuitive. But what I'm looking at now is passing knowledge along with money to the next generations. Because I'd never thought about this when I was 25, because I was worried about myself first. And now, as I've grown and developed, now I'm like, well, I can take money and pass it along to the next generation and next generation after that and after that and after that, right? you know and so that's what's become important to me. The mindset hasn't changed, because that's actually what I want to pass on. Now how I implement has changed tremendously between 25 and 55 as we go along, and I think that's where we can have this idea that time can be a finite resource or can be an infinite resource. Really just depends on how we look at it. And this idea of, I'm only here for a finite amount of time, I understand that. But if I can pass knowledge and money, that's the true generational wealth that's important to me. And that's what's really come really important to me. And now it starts with, again, if I'm having the conversation with a 25-year-old, it's like, you need to start on the wealth building process so you can build your own wealth. Take the knowledge that I'm sharing with you and that you're gathering from other people, pass that along to the next generation. So eventually we can raise, if you can imagine a whole harbor of people sitting out there, and then we can flood that harbor with knowledge and understanding of how this works. We can raise all the boats. And then if they can add some of their additional knowledge and understanding to that same harbor, then we raise it even higher, to the point where it's this exponential growth of knowledge and understanding around money. Because right now, I have to say that probably the American people are slave or captive to this scarcity mindset, into this poverty way of thinking. Where I don't think it has to be that way. I think it's just we can change our thought process, and then once we have our process, it's kind of like the old, when you're flying on a plane, secure your mask first before you help the next person. That's kind of what we have to do with our own stuff. We have to get our own house in order, and then help that next generation. So that's why I'm saying, if I'm talking to a 25-year-old, hey, let's get your mask on first. If I'm talking to somebody that's 60 and's got some assets and some wealth, well, you got your mask on. Now, what are we doing to put the mask onto that next generation and generation after? And again, it's not about just passing money along. And I think there's a big misconception about the idea that we can pass money from one generation to the next. Yeah, and that might work for one generation. And what we typically see is after 3 generations, after that 3rd generation is where we start to see the whole idea fall apart. Because what aren't they doing? We have to ask ourselves, what are they not doing? They've obviously passed assets and they've passed money along the way, but they haven't necessarily passed wealth along the way. And to me, wealth is money, over a period of time, with the knowledge and understanding of how to use it. And the knowledge and understanding of how to use it a lot of times gets lost. And we can look at a show that used to be on. I don't know if it's on anymore. I used to watch it because it was just amazing to me. It was called How the Lottery Ruined My Life.
Mm-hmm.
And it just showed how people found total misery after they won the lottery. And within 5 years, again, this goes back, I hadn't really thought about that until right now. It goes back 5 years, 6 years from after they won the lottery, they're back to being broke again. Isn't that the same thing Nelson was saying in his book?
Well, and I think a lot of people view it goes, this is just, it all circumvents back to the mindset about money that, often you joke amongst friends when you have that conversation about, well, especially when the Powerball, right? When the
Right.
Powerball was up to an obscene amount of money a couple years ago, and you're
Billion
having these
dollars or
conversations about, oh, what would you do with it? What would you do with it? Well, my my first answer is, the first thing I do is, we make sure that our parents were completely set up for the rest of their life to do whatever they wanted, because they put a roof over my head. They made sure I had food on the table. I had a car to get to and from school and to and from soccer practice and all that stuff. Like, I'd take care of my parents first, and then the other thing I'd want to do is I'd want to set my future self up. And whether or not that was my kid, me or whatever, that's where I would go, is because I don't want that scarcity mindset. I want to be smart about my money
Yeah.
rather than saying, "Oh my God, look at all this money that I have, and look at all these shiny, pretty toys that I can buy, and all these, things that make me look." It's a again the psychology of it. Most people think that money makes them feel good, but it just, to me, it doesn't. It's, I want to have the experiences. I want to pass on that, the knowledge of money and budgeting. Because even still, you still have to budget, right? How much are you going to spend on groceries? You have a cell phone bill this month. It's, your utility bill, all that stuff.
Yeah. And I think, that's a great point, is from the standpoint of um, thinking smartly about it. But I go back to the analogy of being on the plane. We have to put the mask on ourselves and say, what is that knowledge and understanding we have to have about money? Because if we don't have that knowledge and understanding, that it's going to be gone fairly quick, no matter what the amount is. Because we just, people that have this consumer mindset, and consumer mindset's just kind of what's popping in my head right now. People that have that consumer mindset, we've been conditioned to consume. We have been conditioned to say, well, what assets could I buy, or what things could I do in order to perpetuate a generational mind shift, a generational shift. So my kids, again, this is why it goes back to the third generation. You might say, well, I'm going to give my kid, I'm going to set up all this money so that when I'm no longer here to provide cash for them, they're going to have cash. And again, I'm in the insurance business. We see it on occasions where people have large life insurance policies, beneficiaries paid out. But if we don't have the conversation of how to think about it, within a couple of years, all that money, no matter how many millions it is, can be gone. It was designed to replace an income for life, but within a couple of years, it can be all gone. It's because the mindset around how to use money, the thoughts about how we use money, like I said, for whatever reason, and I think it's just because it's so emotional with people, right? The whole idea of money, having wealth can be a very scary thing to people. There can be shame around having money, can be shame around not having money, can be a shame around being different than the pack. There's just so many things wrapped around money that people have a tendency to, like I said, they just kind of lose their mind and do what I call silly things, right? Instead of educating themselves on how money works, looking at people, pointing at people, saying, hey, they got wealth. Their families had wealth for 3 to 5 years, 3 to 5 generations. What are they doing differently than everybody else out there? Oh, again, they probably love themselves and their own family more than they love Wells Fargo. That's probably one of them. Another one is, they understand that money has to flow. What I mean by that is, think about, again, I used the analogy earlier that people take this finite thing that they have on this earth and they exchange that for money, and they're have such a scarcity mindset around it that they squeeze and hold on to that money like crazy. You ever try to squeeze and hold on to water?
Doesn't
Think
work very
about,
well.
doesn't work very well. But water has to flow. And if you try to squeeze and hold on to it, again, from a scarcity mindset, it will flow. It will flow out of your hands somewhere else. So take a step back and say, okay, I have an asset. How do I make this thing work? And I use the analogy too. And this has been a couple of years ago. But my son Josh and I were out one spring walking down the streets of our town. And our town is, it's a small town. It doesn't have curb and gutter. It's got, the open ditches where water flows. And it was in the spring. We had a lot of snow. So water was flowing pretty well. And we're out walking our new dog that we got. And so him and I were walking along, and he asked me, he said, Dad, what do you do? And I thought that was a great question. So I said, well, I teach people how money works. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, money is a lot like water. It has to flow. And he kind of looks at me like he didn't quite understand what I was talking about. And I said, well, think about it from this standpoint. So where does water get its most power? Where's water most powerful? And we're watching the ditch, the water flow through the ditch, and it's cutting through the snow. For people that live in the southern hemisphere, it's the white stuff that freezes in the wintertime. But the water's cutting through the snow, and it's cutting through the ditch, and it's creating this kind of this mini gorge in the ditch, because it's eating away at the dirt on the ditch. And he said, well, it's kind of like a windmill. Water can turn not a windmill, but a water wheel, or it can turn turbines and a dam. That's where it creates energy. That's where it has its most power. I said, well, that's exactly right. And I said, now look at the pond behind your house. I said, now that's water that's stagnant. Well, that's water that's just sitting still. And I said, what happens to that water over the summer? He says, well, it soaks into the ground, it evaporates, and it gets stinky. And I said, your money's very much just like that. If you leave your money sit, if you put your money in a place that just sits, what happens to that money? It evaporates. It evaporates due to inflation and taxes and fees, right? Same thing. It evaporates. And it becomes stagnant because it's not working. It's not getting to its greatest potential. And so what have we been conditioned to think as consumers? We earn money. The first thing we do is we do what? We save money into somebody else's banking account. So we take this money and we save it into somebody else's banking account. Then what do? What happens to that money? Well, the bank that we've just deposited that money into, we've been conditioned to think that that's where we need to put our money, right? Bring your kid down, they'll get a sucker, they'll get a special toy. So we take them into a bank to be conditioned to think that we get to take our time, our finite time that we traded for money, and we put it into somebody else's account. Do they just sit on that money hoping someday you come back and get it? Or do they put it to work? They understand that money has to flow. So they put it to work, and then they lend it out. They buy real estate. They do all these things that they tell you not to do. So our money becomes stagnant, becomes icky. We have no value. Right now, the interest rates are so low that the banks have convinced us that our money has no value. If you think about it, if you look at what value is, with low interest rates, they're saying your money has zero value, to the point where we're even going to charge you for putting money here at our bank, potentially. Well, then don't put your money in the bank. Put it somewhere else. Start thinking a little bit differently. Think about those that have wealth. They don't put their money in the bank. They store it other places. And then when they do put it to work, they put it to work like banks or other people that have wealth. And then now their money's starting to flow just like the banks. So that was one of the analogies that I love to use because it was such a powerful event, trying to teach him how to think differently. Money has to flow, because when it's flowing, that's when it has its power. When it sits there, it becomes stagnant. So don't let your money sit and become stagnant, because when it's sitting and becoming stagnant, it's becoming stagnant for you, but it's not becoming stagnant for the bank. And this goes back to the point where when we're using it, I'm going to encourage you to use it. Again, love your family more than you love Wells Fargo, because you're just giving it to Wells Fargo and letting it sit there, and they're using it. And then they're going to turn around and they're going to borrow you the money, and they're going to charge you an interest. So go figure how that works.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just the whole concept of money. Again, I hate to beat a dead horse, but just the mindset of it is key, in my opinion. I think that just drives so much of how we save it, handle it, spend it, store it, everything.
Yeah, and then just kind of recapping, and I may have touched on it, but just to recap, what I was saying is that we have finite time, but if we take that finite time and we have, people want to say, well, you're only going to have so much, a finite amount of money. Well, I don't believe that's the case. I think there's an infinite amount of money that can be made or earned, or cash flow that can come to us. If again, the time thing is infinite to me, because now we're taking the knowledge that I'm helping people with, and then again, getting their information, their knowledge, their experiences, adding it to it, passing it out on to the next generation, and teaching the next generation to do the same thing. So we can have the snowball effect on passing wealth from one generation to the next. Because ultimately, that's what we want to do. I think as individuals, we want to pass this legacy on, and then we might not have kids. We might be single individuals, but do we want to make somebody in our life better off, not just by money, but with the knowledge and understanding of how to do it? Because it's easy. I'm going to say this: it's easy to make money, very difficult to hold on to it. It's easy to make money, but it's very difficult to pass it along, because we're not just passing along dollars. They're not just money's just gold in a bucket, or dollar bills in an account. The knowledge on how to use it is the true value that we can pass along to that next generation. Because no matter if they have gold passed to them, or the lottery winnings, or a large life insurance policy, no matter what it is, that knowledge on how to grow and keep it will always be there. So if they have zero to work with, why do people that have started off in this world with nothing to the name, no family, nobody to help them, making millions of dollars in this world, and creating tremendous wealth. It's because they found something. They had an understanding that a lot of people aren't willing to educate themselves out, because they're willing to step outside the norm, the matrix, as it were, and say, is there a better way to go about this? Because again, this whole idea behind conditioned thinking, and that's how money works, is that it flows. It's a tool. It's an asset for us to use. But if we're not willing to figure out how to use it, again, it goes back to the analogy, is that we're taking this screwdriver and we're using it as a hammer, or we're taking this hammer using it as a screwdriver. If we're not using it the right way, it's not going to be very effective. And quite frankly, today's society, I don't believe is teaching. There's very few people out there teaching and empowering other people on how to use these tools correctly. We have so few craftsmen when it comes to the use of these tools. And so again, my job is to empower you, not to do it for you, not to say that I want to take your money and grow an asset for you, because quite frankly, that's your asset to grow. My job is to empower you to go get rid of the weeds and the misinformation out in your financial garden, or in your brain, as it were, if you can use that analogy. Get rid of those weeds, get rid of those things that are slowing you down and stopping you from being the most effective use of that asset or that resource that you have. Well,
I certainly feel empowered to go do
Good.
Things differently.
Well, it is a process. It's not an event. It is a lifetime change. Always a lifetime change, because we have a paradigm that if you think about, you have a boat anchored and it's got 10 anchors down around it, holding the boat down from shifting from one way to the other. If we want to shift this paradigm, we're going to have to drag those paradigms, those anchors, kicking and screaming, because we want to go back to the comfort of what we already know. Mm-hmm. New knowledge and new understanding is a bit uncomfortable. It's a bit scary. But as we move through that process, and if we're guided with elite level coaching, which is what I'm telling people is, let's find those experts in these fields and say, how can I do this? And find someone that's willing to coach or empower you or mentor you through that process. Your paradigms are going to shift. Your thought process is going to shift. It's not going to happen overnight, because it's always going to want to pull you back. It's always going to want to be resisting you. So now what we have to do is, as we're thinking about how money works, some of the things I might have shared with you might be completely brand new. You've never heard about it before. And if we don't do anything about it, if we don't take any action, then you're probably going to be pulled back to where you're at. But then if we come again with that same idea, that same thought process, through a discussion, through working with me or somebody, on our team, we move that paradigm a little bit at a time, to the point where eventually we're going to get to the point where it's different than most people. It does take time. It's not an event. It's really a process. If you're enjoying this podcast, or know anyone else that might be interested, please be sure to hit the subscribe button, and please leave a review. This will help this podcast reach and help more people by ranking higher in searches, and ultimately help more people get out of financial bondage. And don't be afraid to share this podcast with your friends and family, as we can be easily found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.